Hi besties. I am so grateful for your support to Folktales by Aijay. Where are you watching from? Let's dive in, but don't forget to like, subscribe and leave a comment. Zara had never known what it felt like to belong. She was always the quiet girl in the corner, her heart heavy with dreams that felt too far away. Life had never been kind to her, especially after her father passed away. He had been the only parent who ever showed her love, but when he died, everything changed. Her stepmother, a woman with no patience for Zara, told her to pack her things and leave. "You're a burden," her stepmother had said coldly, not even sparing a second glance as she shooed Zara out into the streets. With no family left and nowhere to go, Zara found herself wandering through the crowded streets of the city. The sound of busy feet, the chatter of people, and the scent of food from street vendors filled the air, but none of it brought her any comfort. She was hungry, alone, and desperate. It wasn't that Zara didn't try. She knocked on doors asking for work, offering to clean, cook, or do anything in exchange for food. But most people turned her away, some even laughing at her. She was just a poor girl with no family and no future. But Zara didn't give up. Each time she was rejected, she wiped away her tears, squared her shoulders, and kept going. That was how she found herself on the steps of a grand house late one evening, her stomach growling louder than the city itself. She hesitated. At first, this house looked different. The walls were tall, with vines creeping up them like a storybook castle. The gates were golden, gleaming under the moonlight. Zara didn't belong in a place like this. Yet, when she noticed the light flickering inside the house, she knew she couldn't just leave. She stood at the entrance, looking up at the massive door. Her hands trembled as she lifted them to knock, unsure whether this would be another door that would close in her face. But just as her knuckles brushed the door, it opened. A tall man, well-dressed and with a serious expression on his face, stood before her. "What do you want?" His voice was firm, but not unkind. Zara swallowed hard, feeling smaller than ever. "Please, sir. I need work. Just a little food, maybe a place to sleep for the night," she said, her voice barely a whisper. The man looked at her for a long moment, his eyes studying her worn clothes and tired face. Zara braced herself for rejection. But instead, he stepped back, gesturing for her to come inside. "I don't usually take strangers in, but I can't leave you out there like this," he said with a sigh. "Come inside. I'll give you a roof for the night." Zara didn't know why, but she felt a small flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, things would get better. Zara stepped into the house, her eyes wide as she took in the luxurious surroundings. The floor was polished marble, the walls adorned with golden frames, and soft, plush rugs covered the floors like something out of a dream. This was nothing like the small, cramped house she had grown up in. She was used to the smell of old wood and the faint hum of a small fan. But here, the air was fresh, filled with the scent of lavender and polished wood. The man, Mr. Solomon, as she later learned his name, was led her down a long corridor to a room at the back of the house. It was simple, with a bed and a small wooden table, but to Zara, it felt like a palace. She had never had a room of her own before, and now she was given one. But she knew better than to get too comfortable. She couldn't forget that she was still a stranger in this grand house, a maid at best. Mr. Solomon turned to her as she stepped inside. "You'll stay here for now," he said, his tone firm yet not unkind. "I'll get you something to eat in a little while. You're free to rest, but in the morning, I expect you to help around the house." Zara nodded, unsure of what to say. She wanted to thank him, but she didn't want to seem too eager or too weak. She had learned long ago not to show too much gratitude, not unless it was earned. But Mr. Solomon's offer of shelter was kindness she didn't know how to repay. As the night wore on, Zara sat on the edge of the bed, staring out the window. The lights of the city twinkled below, but she felt far from home. The loneliness that had been a constant companion since her father died returned, though now it seemed more complicated. It wasn't just that she was alone. It was that she felt as if she were living someone else's life. She didn't belong here, in a house like this, with a man she didn't know. But as she heard footsteps approaching down the hallway, her thoughts were interrupted. Mr. Solomon appeared at the door, holding a tray of food. "Here," he said, setting it down on the small table. "I didn't know what you liked, so I've made some rice and stew. I hope it's all right." Zara smiled, her stomach growling at the sight of the steaming food. "It's perfect," she said quietly. Mr. Solomon paused for a moment, watching her as she began to eat. There was something in his eyes, a flicker of something that Zara couldn't quite place. He didn't seem like the type of man to go out of his way for anyone, but here he was, offering her food, shelter, and kindness without asking for anything in return. "I don't know your story, Zara," he said softly. "But I know what it's like to lose someone. To feel like you have nothing left." Zara looked up from her food, surprised. How did he know? She had never told him about her father or her stepmother. But something in his voice made her feel as though he understood more than he let on. I lost my father," Zara whispered. "And my stepmother threw me out." Mr. Solomon nodded slowly, his gaze distant. "I lost my wife many years ago. It's been hard to move on since then. Sometimes, it feels like I'm just going through the motions." Zara didn't know what to say. She had heard about Mr. Solomon's wife, though only in whispers among the servants. He had never spoken of her openly, and she didn't know if it was something he wanted to forget or something he was still grieving. "Do you want to talk about her?" Zara asked, her voice tentative. It was an odd question, but something told her that Mr. Solomon needed to speak, even if he didn't know it. For a moment, he seemed to struggle with the words. Then, finally, he spoke. "Her name was Leah. She was everything to me, my partner, my best friend. But one day, she was taken from me in an accident. I've never really recovered from it." Zara felt a deep sadness in her chest. She couldn't imagine losing someone like that. It made her own struggles seem small in comparison. "I'm sorry," she said softly. He nodded, the lines on his face deepening. "It's a pain that never truly goes away. But that's why I help people like you. Maybe, just maybe, it makes me feel less alone." Zara's heart softened. For the first time since she arrived, she felt a small spark of warmth towards Mr. Solomon. He wasn't just some rich, distant man. He was someone who had suffered too, just like her. Maybe their pain wasn't the same, but it was pain all the same. "Thank you for giving me a place to stay," Zara said quietly, her voice full of sincerity. Mr. Solomon gave a small smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "You're welcome. But remember, this isn't charity. You'll be working for me, earning your keep." Zara nodded, understanding the unspoken rules. She wasn't a guest here, she was a maid, and she would work hard to prove herself. But for the first time in a long while, she felt like she had a chance. A chance to start over, a chance to build something for herself. And that was more than she had ever hoped for. The days passed slowly at Mr. Solomon's house, but each one brought something new. Zara worked hard, sweeping, dusting, and preparing meals. Mr. Solomon was a quiet man, but she soon realized that his silence wasn't one of coldness. It was as if he had withdrawn into himself, as though the weight of his memories had made it hard for him to connect with the world around him. Zara was determined to stay out of his way, to do her work without being noticed. She had learned early on that people like Mr. Solomon didn't have time for anyone who wasn't useful to them. But every once in a while, their paths would cross, and she would catch a glimpse of something more in his eyes, a hint of sadness, of longing, of something he wasn't ready to share. One afternoon, as Zara was cleaning the large dining room, she found an old photograph on the floor, partially hidden beneath the edge of the table. It was a picture of Mr. Solomon and a woman, both smiling widely. The woman was beautiful, with long dark hair and kind eyes. Zara recognized her instantly. "That's Leah," Mr. Solomon said from the doorway, startling Zara. She hadn't heard him approach. She turned to face him, holding the photograph in her hand. "She was your wife?" Zara asked, her voice soft. He nodded, his eyes fixed on the photo. "Yes. She was the love of my life." Zara felt a pang of sympathy for him. It was clear that Mr. Solomon still held on to the memory of his wife, even though years had passed. The sadness in his eyes spoke volumes, and Zara couldn't help but wonder if he would ever truly heal. "She was kind to everyone," Mr. Solomon continued, his voice quieter now. "She always believed in the good in people. She would have wanted me to be happy again. But I don't know if I can ever feel that way." Zara didn't know how to respond. She wanted to say something comforting, but the words felt inadequate. Instead, she simply nodded, unsure of what else to do. For a long moment, they both stood there, staring at the photograph. The silence was heavy, filled with unspoken words and memories that neither of them could forget. Finally, Mr. Solomon turned away, his face unreadable. "You should get back to work," he said, his voice rough. "I'll leave you to it." As he left the room, Zara couldn't shake the feeling that she had witnessed something deeply personal. Mr. Solomon's pain was more than just the loss of his wife, it was the loss of a part of himself, a part that he might never get back. But Zara couldn't help but feel a strange sense of connection to him. She didn't know why, but she knew that somehow, they were both on the same journey, one that neither of them had chosen, but one that might lead to healing if they could face it together. Zara's days in Mr. Solomon's house began to settle into a routine. The work wasn't easy, but she grew accustomed to it. She learned the layout of the house, where everything belonged, and the kind of food Mr. Solomon liked. She was careful not to intrude too much on his space, but little by little, she began to notice small changes in his behavior. He would smile more often, albeit briefly, and he started to ask her how her day had been. At first, Zara thought it was just politeness, but soon she realized that he genuinely cared about her well-being. One evening, after a particularly long day, Mr. Solomon invited Zara to join him for dinner. "You've been working hard," he said. "It's the least I can do to thank you." Zara hesitated, unsure whether she should accept. She wasn't used to being invited to dinner with someone so wealthy. But eventually, she agreed. As they sat down at the table, Zara felt an odd sense of comfort in Mr. Solomon's presence. He wasn't the cold, distant man she had first met. He had a warmth to him that made her feel at ease. They spoke about everything and nothing about the weather, the food, and even small anecdotes from Zara's childhood. To her surprise, Mr. Solomon was a good listener. He asked questions, listened carefully, and even laughed at her stories, something Zara hadn't expected from a man of his stature. "I've never really talked to anyone like this before," Mr. Solomon admitted after a while. "I don't know what it is about you, Zara. But you make me feel like I can actually talk about the things I've buried for so long." Zara looked at him, surprised. She hadn't realized how much he had kept to himself all these years. It was as if the walls he had built around himself were slowly beginning to crumble, piece by piece. "I'm glad I could listen," Zara said softly. "Sometimes, all it takes is someone to listen." And for the first time, Zara saw a small flicker of hope in Mr. Solomon's eyes. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make her believe that maybe just maybe there was more to her staying in this house than just being a maid. Zara continued to work diligently, her days filled with the routines of cleaning, cooking, and organizing. Despite the quiet, almost lonely atmosphere of the house, she found small comforts in the little things, the soft sound of rain tapping against the windows, the scent of fresh flowers Mr. Solomon sometimes brought home, and the warmth of the fire she tended to in the evenings. But what truly surprised her was how Mr. Solomon had started to change. He seemed more alive, more present. He smiled at her more often, and even began to ask her opinions on small things like how to arrange the furniture in the drawing room or what flowers he should order for the table. It was strange to her that he would value her opinion, but it made her feel like she was part of something. One evening, as Zara was finishing up her chores, she noticed that Mr. Solomon had left a small box on her bed. It was wrapped in simple brown paper, tied with a string. Her heart skipped a beat as she approached it. What could this be? She hadn't done anything to warrant a gift. Hesitantly, she untied the string and opened the paper, revealing a beautiful blue dress, the kind she'd only ever seen in stores or on the women in the market, but never on herself. It was soft to the touch, and the color reminded her of the sky just before the sunset, a deep, rich blue. It was elegant, with delicate lace at the edges, something that could never be mistaken for the rag she had worn when she first arrived. Zara stood still for a moment, unsure how to react. She wasn't used to receiving such things. She hadn't grown up with luxuries, and her stepmother's disdain for her had made her feel unworthy of any kindness, even when it was given. Her hands trembled as she reached for the note that had been tucked inside the box. It was simple, written in Mr. Solomon's neat handwriting. For your hard work and the kindness you've shown. You deserve more than what this house has given you. Zara's breath caught in her throat. She had never felt so seen before. It wasn't just a gift, it was a recognition of who she was, of the person she had become since coming to this house. She had worked hard, but she had also shared something with Mr. Solomon: her quiet strength, her willingness to listen, and her ability to care despite everything she had been through. That night, after dinner, Mr. Solomon approached her, his eyes still a little distant but softer than they had ever been. I hope it fits, he said with a small smile. I thought you deserved something nice. You've been here for a while, and I want you to know that I appreciate everything you've done. Zara didn't know what to say. She had never been good with words when it came to gratitude, but she found herself speaking from the heart. Thank you, she said softly. It's beautiful. I didn't expect this. Mr. Solomon nodded, as though it wasn't a big deal. It's not much, but it's something I wanted to do. You're more than just a maid, Zara. You've become a part of this house in ways I didn't expect. His words were simple, but they struck a chord deep inside her. She had never considered herself more than a servant in this grand house. But now, Mr. Solomon had acknowledged her in a way that made her feel valued, truly valued. Over the next few days, Zara wore the dress, and each time she passed Mr. Solomon, he would give her a small, approving smile. It wasn't just about the dress, it was about the unspoken connection that had begun to grow between them. He was seeing her differently now, and Zara couldn't help but wonder if it was the beginning of something more than just a maid and her employer. But even as she began to let herself hope, doubts lingered. Zara knew she had to be careful. She couldn't let herself get too close, couldn't allow herself to fall for someone like him, a man with a past so heavy, a man who could never truly see her as an equal. The evening air was thick with tension as Zara worked in the garden, trimming the roses that lined the stone walkway. The house was quiet tonight, and for the first time in a long while, it felt like a place of peace. Mr. Solomon had been away for a few days on business, and it gave Zara a rare moment to herself. She had spent hours contemplating the past few weeks, thinking about her growing feelings for Mr. Solomon. She had never imagined that someone like him, someone so distant and reserved, could stir something so deep within her. But it was more than that. His kindness, his vulnerability, the way he had opened up to her about his past, made her believe that maybe, just maybe, they were two souls on a journey toward healing. But tonight, that belief was shaken to its core. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway snapped Zara out of her thoughts. She looked up, expecting it to be Mr. Solomon returning from his trip. Instead, she saw a woman stepping out of the car. She was tall, elegant, and dressed in a sleek black dress, her blonde hair pulled back into a neat ponytail. Zara couldn't place her at first, but the woman's presence sent an unfamiliar chill down her spine. Mr. Solomon stepped out of the house to greet her, his face lighting up in a way Zara had never seen before. They embraced briefly, and Zara watched, confused and hurt, as the woman smiled at him, a smile that was warm, affectionate, and intimate. Zara felt her heart sink. She had known Mr. Solomon was wealthy and had a life outside of the house, but seeing him with this woman, someone who seemed so close to him, someone who obviously meant more to him than just a business acquaintance, shattered something inside her. She turned away quickly, hiding her emotions behind the flowers, trying not to let them see her. She wasn't supposed to feel this way. She was just the maid. The help. As she watched them from the shadows, Zara realized that Mr. Solomon wasn't just kind. He wasn't just a man who had taken pity on her. He was engaged to this woman, this elegant woman who had been waiting for him while he was away. Zara's heart ached, and she felt foolish for allowing herself to believe in a connection that could never be. Later that evening, Zara found herself alone in her room, staring at the dress Mr. Solomon had given her. It seemed to mock her now, a reminder of the illusion she had built in her heart. And just when she thought her emotions couldn't twist any further, a knock came at the door. It was Mr. Solomon. "Zara, I need to talk to you," he said quietly. Zara's heart raced. She didn't know what to expect, but deep down, she feared that the conversation they were about to have would change everything. Mr. Solomon stepped inside, his expression troubled. He didn't wait for an invitation to sit, instead sinking down onto the chair by the window. He ran a hand through his hair, something that made Zara's stomach tighten. "I need to explain," he began, his voice heavy. "There's something you don't know about me, about my life." Zara stood silently, unsure whether she wanted to hear whatever he had to say. She already knew that his engagement to the woman outside had shattered her illusion, but she didn't expect him to acknowledge it. "I'm engaged," he continued, his words almost a whisper. "To someone my family chose for me. Someone I don't love. Her name is Elisa. And I've been avoiding the inevitable for a long time." Zara's heart skipped a beat. So, it was true. He was engaged, and he had been lying to her all this time. The truth had been there all along, but she had refused to see it. But you're not in love with her," Zara said, her voice barely above a whisper. He shook his head. "No. But I've been trapped in this life for so long. I never thought I'd feel anything for anyone again. Until you." Zara's heart raced, her mind spinning. Could he truly mean that? Was he really telling her the truth, or was he just feeling guilty for making her hope? "I don't want to marry Elisa," Mr. Solomon confessed, his voice raw with emotion. "But I feel obligated to. I don't know how to escape. And I don't know if I can ask you to be a part of my life, not when I'm tied to someone else." Zara looked at him, a million thoughts racing through her mind. He wasn't just a man she worked for anymore, he was someone who had allowed her to see parts of him no one else had ever seen. But could they ever truly have a future together? Zara couldn't deny the connection between them, but there were too many obstacles in the way, too many complications in his life and in hers. She wasn't sure she was ready to walk that path, especially when she didn't know where it would lead. As she stood there in silence, the weight of his confession hung in the air between them. Would their connection survive the truth? Zara's emotions were in turmoil. She couldn't quite understand why Mr. Solomon had told her all this, why he had shared his deepest secrets with her. Zara stood in her small room, Mr. Solomon's confession hanging between them like an invisible thread pulling at her heart. His words echoed in her mind, and for a moment everything felt still, as if the world had paused. He wasn't just the rich man she had worked for. He was someone who had been struggling with his own burdens, his own feelings, and now, she was caught in the middle of it. "I don't know what to do, Zara," Mr. Solomon said softly, his gaze fixed on the floor, avoiding her eyes. "I never expected to feel this way about anyone, especially someone like you." Zara felt her heart race. The words he spoke were too heavy, too raw. She wasn't sure if she was ready to carry them. But what she did know was that she couldn't keep pretending things were simple. It wasn't just about being a maid anymore, it wasn't just about the work she did for him. There was something real, something undeniable between them, and it felt both exciting and terrifying. I don't know either, Zara replied, her voice barely audible. You've given me so much to think about. I never imagined that I would be in a position like this. She walked to the window, staring out at the stars twinkling in the night sky. I came here to escape, to find some kind of safety, but now, it feels like I've walked into a world I don't understand. I've been so focused on surviving that I never thought I could feel anything else. Mr. Solomon stood up, his hands trembling slightly as he approached her. He was so close now, the distance between them shrinking with every word spoken. Zara, I don't want to make you feel uncomfortable. I don't want to put you in a position where you feel like you have to choose between me and your own dreams. But I can't keep pretending like nothing's happening between us. Zara closed her eyes, trying to gather her thoughts. She had to be strong. She had to make decisions that were right for her, decisions that wouldn't leave her trapped in the same place she had been before, stuck in a world of obligation, fear, and uncertainty. I never asked for any of this, she said quietly, her voice tinged with both frustration and vulnerability. I didn't ask to fall for someone I shouldn't fall for. I didn't ask to be caught in the middle of something so complicated. He reached out, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. I know, he whispered. I never asked for this either. But I can't deny how I feel. I want more than just a marriage of convenience. I want more than just the life that was planned for me. I want to live. Zara turned to face him, meeting his eyes for the first time that evening. She saw the pain in his gaze, the conflict within him that mirrored her own. He was offering her something she had never imagined, a chance at a future, a chance at something more than survival. But could she take that step? Could she risk everything she had worked so hard for? I don't know what the right choice is, Zara said, her voice shaking with uncertainty. I don't know if we can have something real, or if this is just a fleeting moment in time. But I do know one thing, I can't keep pretending that I'm okay with this, whatever this is. Mr. Solomon's expression softened, and he nodded slowly. I understand. And whatever you decide, I will respect it. But just know that you've changed my life. You've made me see things differently. You've given me hope. The sincerity in his voice touched her deeply. Zara felt something stir within her, a desire to believe in the possibility of something more, something better. But she also knew that this path wouldn't be easy. There were too many complications, too many things outside of their control. Thank you for being honest with me, Zara said, her voice barely above a whisper. I'll think about everything you've said. But I need time. I can't just make a decision like this overnight. Mr. Solomon gave her a small, understanding smile. Take all the time you need. I won't rush you. As he left the room, Zara felt both lighter and heavier at the same time. She was torn between the man she had come to care for and the life she had worked so hard to build for herself. The days following the conversation with Mr. Solomon were a blur of emotions and confusion. Zara spent long hours in the garden, lost in thought, trying to make sense of everything. The dress Mr. Solomon had given her hung in the corner of her room, a reminder of the tenderness he had shown her, and of the uncertain future that lay ahead. But things began to shift in small ways. Zara noticed that Mr. Solomon had started to change his routine. He spent more time with her, and his gestures of kindness became more frequent. One morning, he asked her to join him for breakfast, a simple act that seemed small but spoke volumes. They shared a quiet meal together, talking about trivial matters, how the weather was changing, what kind of tea she preferred. And yet, with every conversation, Zara could feel the walls that had once separated them slowly crumbling. But as the days went on, Zara could sense something deeper stirring within her. She could no longer deny her feelings. She had fallen for him. In the quiet moments they shared, in the way he cared for her, Zara had begun to see him in a different light. He wasn't just the wealthy man she had once thought him to be, he was someone who was struggling with his own desires, his own heart. Zara's thoughts were interrupted one evening when Mr. Solomon asked her to accompany him to a charity gala he was hosting. It was a formal event, and Zara's heart sank at the thought of stepping into a world so far removed from her own. She had never been to such an event before where everyone was impeccably dressed, their lives a blur of perfection. It felt like a place she didn't belong. But when Mr. Solomon looked at her with a pleading expression, something in her softened. "Please, Zara. I need you by my side tonight. It's just a formality, but I don't want to go alone." Zara hesitated, unsure of what to do. But deep down, she knew that this was a turning point. This was the moment where she would have to choose whether to stay in the shadows of her own fear, or step into the light and embrace what lay ahead. "I'll go," Zara said, her voice barely above a whisper. And as she said those words, something inside her shifted. She wasn't just the maid anymore. She wasn't just the poor girl who had been thrown out on the street. She was someone who had a choice to take control of her own life. The night of the gala arrived, and Zara stood before a mirror, staring at herself in the dress Mr. Solomon had given her. She had never felt so out of place and yet so alive at the same time. Her reflection was unfamiliar, a girl dressed in fine clothing, standing on the edge of a life she wasn't sure she was ready to enter. When Mr. Solomon arrived to pick her up, he smiled at her in surprise, as though he hadn't expected her to truly come. "You look beautiful," he said softly, his eyes filled with admiration. Zara felt a rush of emotions flood her chest. This was at the moment she would have to step into a world she had never imagined. She could feel the weight of her decision pressing down on her. The path she chose tonight would shape her future forever. As they entered the gala together, the world seemed to shift around her. She was no longer just a maid, she was someone Mr. Solomon had chosen to stand by his side. The other guests looked at her with curiosity, some with disdain, but Zara kept her head held high. And in that moment, she realized something that took her breath away. This was her choice. She could leave. She could go back to her old life, or she could stay and take a chance on the future Mr. Solomon was offering her. But the real decision was about more than just him, it was about her. About the life she wanted for herself. As they danced together that night, Zara made her choice. She would no longer let fear control her. She would embrace the unknown, step by step. And as she looked into Mr. Solomon's eyes, she knew that whatever came next, it was her future to shape. Thank you besties for watching to the end. What do you think of Zara? Does Zara remind you of anyone? Please share in the comments section. Don't forget to like, share, comment and subscribe to Folktales by Aijay so we can keep bringing you inspiring African folktale stories on Folktales by Aijay.